A lot of the students that I work with in my one-on-one web training are recording their music with live instruments, whether it's piano, guitar, vocals, etc. But many of them are also interested in making use of the virtual instruments that are in Studio One, but they don't have experience with it. Maybe this is the first time that they're using a DAW, or they're coming from another DAW and they're just not sure of what's available in Studio One. So in this video, which I normally wouldn't make because I figure no one is interested in seeing this basic topic, but at this point I've had enough people ask me about the virtual instruments in Studio One, how they can add them, what the different ones are used for, that we'll go ahead and take a look at that. So first of all, we can access the instruments through our browser. So we can click on the Browse in the bottom right hand corner. Now up at the top we can click on the link for instruments or click on the tab up above. Now we can see we have a section for personas, and if I click on the disclosure arrow we can expand that out and see all of the different native instruments that are available. Now if you're only seeing text here and you'd prefer to see the thumbnails, just know that we can click on this button up above to toggle the thumbnail view. Right now we're just seeing the text. We can then again click on that to show all of our instruments. Now we'll just start at the top and make our way down to cover each one of these and what they're useful for. So the CV instrument, we'll skip over this one because this is particularly for working with hardware external synthesizers. So we'll start with the impact. And this is going to be for drums. Anytime that you want to make use of drums, even though I've used this to create entire songs. Actually, I'll leave a little link up at the top right where I created kind of a bare bones song using just the impact, where I'm showing the trigger modes for this device. Our Mai Tai is a polyphonic synthesizer, analog emulation. The Mojito is a monophonic analog emulated synthesizer. Our presence is going to be for if we want to add strings, virtual strings, guitar, piano, cello, you name it. We can use the presence for those type of instruments. Now the sample one is a sampler, and we can load different audio files, whatever audio file we'd like, into this device, and we can come up with creative sounds with this and trigger those audio samples across our keyboard. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. But again, we'll start from the top with our impact. We can simply left click hold and drag that into our arrange view. Now coming up to the top where we see default, I can click on this and let's just go ahead and choose a kit. Now all of the pads are going to be populated, and I should be able to immediately trigger this with my MIDI controller. Okay, so we can hear that playing back, and I'm actually going to Shift and E to expand this instrument track out vertically. And a couple of things to be aware of when you're working with the virtual instruments is that we do need to have the monitor button turned on, because if I turn that off, then we can see the MIDI information from my controllers coming in, but we don't hear the device. So specifically when you are triggering the device or recording the device, we want to have that turned on so we can then hear it. Once you've actually recorded your MIDI information, we don't need to worry about that. If you want to record, we also need to be sure that the record arm button is active, and then all we'd need to do is press the record button down below. I'll press the space bar to stop. We can see that those MIDI notes have been recorded. Let's move this a bit out of the way. Let's press the comma to come back to the beginning of the song. Press the space bar to start playback. Okay, now we can hear this back, and as I mentioned, if I turn the monitor button off now that this has been recorded, we can still hear this playing back. So just bear in mind that if you want to play live, again, I'm triggering my device, we see the MIDI information, but we don't hear anything, and the pads aren't even lighting up here. This is important to have that on so that we'll be able to monitor the sounds coming from our impact. So again, we're just going to do an overview of each of these instruments, and that is our impact. We can go ahead and close that out at any point that we'd like to access any of these instruments after we've added it to our song and closed it out. We can click on this little keyboard icon, and that's going to show our instrument once again in case we need to adjust any parameters. Now I also want to mention that we entered into record and recorded this bit live, but let's click once to select it. I'll press delete to remove that out. And then now I'm going to double click here at bar 2. Let's expand this out to 2 bars. And I'm going to double click on this MIDI part. Let's close out the browser. And I'm going to hold control and use my mouse wheel to zoom in vertically here. Okay, so I just wanted to show that we can actually manually enter notes in. So here's our kick. If I double click, then we can add notes in like so. Okay, while this is selected, I'm going to press P as in Paul. We set up a loop region. I'll press the /. To activate that loop, let's come to the beginning by clicking in the ruler, play this back. Okay, so just know that you can also double click to add the MIDI part, double click again on that MIDI part to open up the editor, and then you can add your notes in manually as well. But going into depth on that is a completely different tutorial. Now, I'm going to delete this out and press Control Shift and P. And in this way, now this was added at our playback cursor, but I want that to be at the beginning of bar 2. Let's extend this out and let's double click on this, because when we Control Shift and P, we actually add a pattern. So now when we double click, we have this pattern view. So we can again add our kick in. Let's add our snare. Let's come to the beginning by clicking in the ruler, press the spacebar. Okay, so we can also use this pattern view as well. Right now we just have 16 steps. So when I added this in, this is essentially one bar because 16 steps is 16th notes. There's 16 16th notes in one bar. But if I were to change the steps to, say, 32, now we can see that this second bar is empty. And then when we come here to fill this in, now we can see that being populated up above. Now, before we move on to the next instrument, the last thing I want to mention about working with Impact is a relatively new feature. Now, we've already seen that clicking on the keyboard icon, we can show the impact if we want to do some adjustments to it. But we also have this new button here, and once we click on that, we have an embedded view for our impact, which is actually pretty awesome. So we can just work within the editor. We don't have to open up that floating impact window. We can trigger our pads here. We can make adjustments to the different parameters for each pad. We can see the waveform for our samples that are in each pad. So this is a very cool and welcome feature that is relatively new in Studio One, so just be aware of that. And we can access this in the regular drum view that we saw before this pattern view as well. While this is open, we can actually click on this keyboard icon and open up that floating window as well. We can also click on this upward facing arrow to detach the editor and make that full screen, even drag it over to a second monitor if you'd like as well. We can reattach by clicking on the downward facing arrow. Okay, let's go ahead and close out our editor and we will remove the impact out. And it's important to remember that we can, while this is highlighted, I can press Shift and T to remove that out, but we're just removing the track in this instance. And if I open up the mix console, we can see that the impact is still here. So let's Control Z to bring that impact or that instrument track back. And we will right click and we can remove track and instrument. And then that's going to take out the instrument as well. Let's again undo that action, because I also want to show that a relatively new feature is that we can hold Shift while we press Delete. Let's select our track actually. Now when we hold Shift and press Delete, that will also remove the instrument and the instrument track. Okay, let's come back to our browser and we'll move on to the Mai Tai. Now again, the Mai Tai is a polyphonic analog emulated virtual instrument. And also again, as I said, this looks a little bit dated, but you can actually get some pretty decent sounds out of this. As we saw with the impact, we can come up to where it says default and we can click on this to expand that out. Let's come to the different pad section. We can see we can have basses, bells, drums, but we'll choose the pad. Let's come down to the mountain pad, and this should be playable immediately with my MIDI controller. We have monitoring engaged. It's armed for recording, so I'm just going to go ahead and trigger with my MIDI controller. Now, speaking of pretty decent sounds, one thing to keep in mind is that you have a little drop down menu here in the bottom right hand corner, and this is normally on normal, I believe. But if we'd like a higher quality sound, we can always click on this and choose between 80s, which is going to be a little bit more of a 80s grungy sound. Then we have normal, high, and supreme. So as we go up to these different qualities, that's going to stress your processor a little bit more. We can see we just have one track in this song, but we have a little bit of CPU activity there. If I click on Supreme, let's see if that changes any at all. Let's go ahead and play this again. So you can see our CPU is a lot more active. But I'm also using Windows Audio to capture audio into my screen capture software. Normally, if you're using your audio interface, the CPU is not going to be as high as this. Now again, we also have basses in here, so if we come to the bass section, okay, so you get the idea. You can go ahead and explore all of the different presets that are available here. And the same thing applies to our Mai Tai as with the drum machine. We want to have this monitor button engaged. If I turn that off, we can again see the MIDI information coming to the instrument track, but we don't hear the actual device. So let's go ahead and turn that on. And also, as with the impact, let's press the / to deactivate our loop. All we need to do once it's armed for recording is click on the record button below. Okay, and we will spacebar to stop. So we can see it's just as easy as that. We now have our MIDI information recorded that is going to trigger our Mai Tai. Okay, showing and hiding the device, we can click on this little keyboard icon. If we'd like to edit the MIDI information, we can simply double click on this MIDI part. That opens up our edit view down below. Let's press W to zoom out so we can see these notes. We can select them, use the up and down arrow to change their pitch. We can select a group of notes, again using the up and down arrow to move one semitone at a time. If I hold shift and use the up arrow, we adjust these by octave. We can also manually add notes by double clicking. These are going to be added in at the current quantized value. So that note was added as 16th notes. If I change this to quarter note, let's double click again. Now we can see that this is added as a quarter note. These are also going to be snapped into place to the current grid value because our snap is turned on. If I turn that off, now it's going to be placed precisely where you click and off of the grid. We can remove by double clicking, or we can left click, hold, and drag to select a group of notes and press delete. Let's close out our edit window and we'll open up our Mai Tai just to talk about a couple other things here. We can access effects here with this panel. So we can see that we have this mod effects button. So if I click, we can toggle that view on and off for our effects. So if I wanted more reverb, we can make that adjustment here. We can switch to bank B for our effects. If I activate the gator, I think we do need to play this back. Let's actually delete the recorded MIDI data and start playback. Let's come back to bank A and turn our reverb off. Okay, so we can hear this a little bit better. Okay, you get the idea. We also have some EQ here. We have distortion and some panning. The adjusting the depth. Okay, so that's our mod and effects section. If we click on the mod A, then we can make adjustments and assign modulation to different parameters. That's a bit beyond the scope of this tutorial, but you can see we have 16 different banks that we can make use of. If we'd like to hide that panel, again, we click there. We can also show a virtual QWERTY keyboard, so we can actually left click on these virtual keys to trigger our device. Also note that if you don't have a MIDI controller, we can press caps lock and use our computer QWERTY keyboard to trigger this device, or any third-party instrument as well. Okay, and so if you're a beginner, don't be intimidated by all of these knobs and everything. Just maybe experiment with the different presets that are available, and then take note of the adjustments that are made when you're looking at these different presets. That can help you get a better idea. You can also come to the default to set it back to the beginning, and then just start exploring with the different parameters. And then you'll start to get a better idea of what each of these do. I also have an in-depth tutorial for the Mai Tai, so if you're interested, you can check that out here in the top right-hand corner. But we should move on because I'm spending more time than I had anticipated. Let's right-click and we will remove track and instrument. Let's come back to our browser. We'll come over to our Mojito, which is a monophonic analog emulation device. So this is going to be good for bass and leads. Let's click on the default. We'll go to the bass lead. Full on bass. Okay, so we have some basic controls. Here's our cutoff. So if we'd like for this to be brighter, our envelope, taking the amp up makes a more gradual introduction to our sound, and taking the release up will extend that length of the note after we release our key. If we'd like to apply, say, modulation to something like our cutoff here, let's actually take that down. And let's change our LFO speed to, say, quarter notes. This is going to increase the depth. We can change the polarity. Okay, so a very basic device, but you can still get some good sounds out of here, especially if you don't have any other synthesizers to work with and you just want to experiment. But we will go ahead and move on to the next instrument. Let's right click and remove track and instrument. Come back to our browser. We then have our presence, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, you're going to find any sort of instrument that you'd like to add, virtual instrument like guitar, violin, strings, woodwinds, and all of those. You'll need to download the sound sets for this device as well. I don't have many that are downloaded, so right now I just have the basic instruments, and we have strings. So let's actually just come to the cellos. We'll choose cello full, and this should be immediately playable with my MIDI controller. We have some reverb that's active down at the bottom. So similar with the Mai Tai, we have this mod and effects button where we can see our effects. We have the same effects A bank and bank B here. Our modulation, and we also have our virtual keyboard, which we can use to audition the sounds. Now if you take notice here, above the keyboard we have this gray horizontal line. This is going to be the range of keys that you can play to trigger this particular device. So down to C1. Now if I were to go below that, now we can see we don't have any sound, and that's because that's outside of this range of where our samples are located. Because when we're using the presence, we're actually triggering pre-recorded samples of the particular instrument that we have loaded into here. Now we have these other red bars that are showing, and these are going to change the articulation for this instrument. So right now we can see we have cello sustain. Now I'm just going to go ahead and click here so you can visually see this, but I could use this key on my MIDI controller. But once I click on this, we can see that this is changed here to, I believe that would be staccato. Okay, let's click on this top one. Crescendo. What else do we have here? Pizzicato. So if you have a larger MIDI controller, you can actually change the articulations while you're playing. Say with your left hand, you can change the articulation and then play back melodies or chords within the playable region here. You can also automate the changes to the articulation within the edit window as well, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Okay, but that is our presence. I think that's pretty straightforward. We could just choose any type of instrument that we want, use our MIDI controller to trigger that. Let's right click on the instrument track. We will remove that track and instrument. I think we may be on our last instrument. Okay, yeah, and this is going to be my favorite, sample 1. So we can left click, hold, and drag that in. But of course, that's when we could do that. Then we can come over, let's say, to the loop section. I'll come to the guitar. Let's come to a loop. I'll just drag this into our waveform display window, and then that's going to be loaded. I can, again, this is arm for recording and for monitoring, so I should be able to immediately trigger with my MIDI controller. And I'm just pressing and holding the key. Now as I play up, we can hear the pitch increases, and it also plays back quicker. If I were to play in a lower register, the pitch is going to be lower, of course, and it's going to play back slower. Now, one important thing about this is that we do have this follow song tempo here. So if I were to go ahead and engage this, we're still going to play at a lower pitch, but the speed is going to be maintained to the tempo of our song. Okay, now if I play in an upper register, instead of playing back quickly, now that this is engaged, we still should play back at the same speed of our song. Okay, versus when I disengage this. Let's actually go up to an even higher register. Okay, so now I'll engage the follow song tempo. Okay, so the further you go away from the original pitch of the sample that you're using, the worse it's going to sound. But sometimes it could be a particular sound that you want to have in your music, especially if you're doing some sort of experimental or electronic music. Now, we have these familiar controls that we saw in the Mai Tai and the presence for showing our effects, but let's show the virtual keyboard, because this is important that this C3, when we drag the samples in, the original sample's typically going to be placed on C3. Okay, and we can see that our root is on C3. If I hover here and use my mouse wheel, I can change that location of the original sample. We see that that white bar then moves. So I feel like this is an important area to be aware of, where your original sample is going to be placed at. Okay, now I'm going to hold shift and use my mouse wheel to pull this back down. Now we can control what portion of our sample is going to be played with these handles, the start and end marker, so I can drag this in, and then once I trigger, we start from there. Let's pull in the right marker. And let's pull this up a little bit, open up our effects section. Let's turn on the delay. Let's put this on quarter. Extend this out. Let's put on our reverb. Okay, so now I'm pressing and holding to play this back, and then it stops at our right marker. If I were to press and release, it's not going to play all the way through because our trigger mode for the amp envelope is set to normal, which means it's going to follow the envelope here, and our release is all the way down. If I take the release time up, and we can see that pop-up window shows the amount of release time that's being added. So now I'll press and release the key, and that's still going to play back because we've taken the release time up. Now we can come up to the top left corner and take this out of normal and choose one shot. So if I take the release time down, now that we're in one shot, I can press and release the key, and it's still going to play back all the way through because we're on one shot. Now we also have toggle. So if let's take this back to the beginning, I'll press a key and release. I'll press that same key to stop it. So we toggle playback on and off by pressing that same key. Next to the mode here, let's put that on one shot. We have reverse. We can normalize the audio. If I use the scroll wheel on my mouse, we can zoom in and out. I can also left click hold and drag down to zoom in or drag up to zoom out. If we are zoomed in like this, we can click on this magnifying glass to zoom to the left and right markers. If I click on the magnifying glass again, then we show the entire sample. Clicking on it again, we show the left and right. So we toggle between these states when we make use of this here. Now I'll zoom out again. If I click on the R, this takes us to the right locator, so we can get a close look at this if we need to make fine adjustments to its position. Maybe you're getting some clicks and pops. You can zoom in close on that. Clicking on the L takes us to our left locator. Now before I get too wrapped up in this, let's just take a quick look at these tabs up at the top, and we'll call it quits for this device. If we start off on this wave where we can see our waveform display and do some editing to our audio sample, we then have a mapping editor, so we can choose what keys that this sample is going to be mapped to. So we can see, let me hold shift and use my mouse wheel to scroll. So we can see that this bar is changing as I adjust here. And that's just showing us what keys are going to trigger the sound. So if I click outside of here, we don't hear it anymore. If I click here, we do. Again, out here, we don't hear anything. Okay, so let's go ahead and take that all the way back out. And I'll again hold shift. Let's move this back so we can get to our C3. We then have our envelopes. This just ties in with the envelope sliders below. So if I increase the release time, we can see that that adjusts here. We can also grab the handles to adjust like so. So we've got envelopes for our pitch, our filter, and our amplitude. Taking the attack time up for our amplitude with the slider takes it up here. If I were to adjust here, we can change it with the handle up above. Now next, which is a really cool feature because not all DAWs that have samplers actually sample. The one in Studio One does. So let's right click in our samples list here, and I'm going to remove the sample that we dragged in here from our browser, and let's actually close out the browser. And we can see my voice, my narration coming into here. So if I were to click on record, we can see that, or we can barely see, that the narration is being recorded here. I'll go ahead and click on stop. And now when I trigger, let's come back to the waveform view, and I'm going to normalize this, and then I'm going to trigger with my computer keyboard. And so this is not playing back, and that's why it's important to keep in mind this root here that I mentioned earlier, because when we record in this manner that I just did, it's going to place the sample on one particular key. If we look down here, we can see that white line. Okay, And we can see up here the root is on C1, but the low and the high is on C1. So I'm going to come to the low and drag that down to C-2. Let's take our high up to G8. I'll again hold Shift, use my scroll wheel on the mouse to center C3. I'll again trigger. And I'm actually going to change the root to C3. I'll just click once and then type in C3. Press enter. We can see that, or we can barely see it. We can see. And let's take the reverb off for a moment. We can see that, or we can barely see, that the narration is being recorded here. Okay, so we can see this can be really cool. There's tons and tons of potential for this. There's some artifacts in there, but that's just due to the nature of my using Windows Audio to capture this video. If you are using an audio interface and a good microphone, you should be able to get a clean recording here as long as you're not clipping. We can see that, or I can turn on the delay. We can see that, or we can barely see that let's switch over to bank B. Let's turn on the gator. We can see that, or we can barely see that the narration is being recorded here. I'll go ahead and click. We can see that, or I can play up. See that, or barely, that the narration is being recorded. Let's go ahead and power that off. Come back to bank A, turn the reverb on. We can see that, or we can barely see that the narration is being recorded here. I'll go ahead and click.
We can see that, or we can barely see.
Okay, and again we can use our start and end markers. See, I really need to wrap up because whenever I work with samplers, I just get lost in it.
The narration.
Okay, so again, we're just doing an overview of all of these different instruments and what they can be used for. I also have a tutorial, I believe I should, on this particular device. I'll leave a link up in the top right corner if you want to learn more about every single parameter that's on here. And again, I'm hoping that they're going to be updating all of these instruments in the next major release for Studio One, hopefully in the next month or two. Who knows? We'll see. But if they don't, you can still do a lot of cool things with these devices. And I hope that this has been helpful for you if you're just getting started in Studio One or switching from another DAW and had questions about using these instruments. Also, I do provide one-on-one training over Zoom for Studio One, so if you're interested in that, you can check out the link in the pinned comment below or the description area of this video. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.